In this video, we discuss a recently published randomized controlled trial that investigated the impact of diets either rich or low in ultra-processed foods on body weight. To this end, I speak with the lead author, Dr. Sam Dicken, a research fellow at the University College London. Sam and I discuss the mechanisms through which ultra-processed foods increase ad libitum calorie intake and body weight, whether some ultra-processed foods are healthier than others, and what we as consumers, but also food companies and policymakers, can do to change the food environment to help combat the obesity epidemic. Okay, very pleased to welcome Sam Dicken to the Nourished by Science YouTube channel. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, Marius. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time. So, this is going to be a conversation about ultra-processed foods, and specifically the difference between ultra-processed foods and minimally processed foods, and how these foods differentially affect how many calories we spontaneously choose to eat, and the degree to which that affects our body weight, fat mass in the long term. Specifically, I invited you to talk about the randomized controlled trial that you recently published. That's the work of your PhD dissertation. What I wanted to start with is take a step back. You know, if we go back in time before you started your randomized controlled trial, what was the science like prior to you, even considering the study? And when you met with your colleagues to design the study, which were the specific gaps in the research and the scientific knowledge that you guys aim to fill?
Yeah, I think it's important to start there. And first of all is clarifying what we mean by ultra processing. So often it gets turned down to just the degree or physical extent of change in a product. But the purpose of processing in ultra processing refers to what was the intent behind the creation of that product. With ultra processed foods, the intent is essentially to maximize the potential profit that can be created. And through that, the use of, say, ingredients not of homemade use, of industrial use only, potentially cosmetic additives to hold ingredients together and to make it more enjoyable from a sensory perspective. And often they tend to be much more energy dense and more palatable. So with that, the evidence a few years ago, so we're looking at 2019, 2020, suggested that when people had more food that was ultra processed in their diet, there were higher risks of poor health outcomes such as obesity, cardiovascular disease, potentially all-cause mortality. But importantly, these are mainly from observational studies, and obviously we can't exactly know for sure if there was some unmeasured confounding that may explain what was linking that high intake of UPF with poor health. But at the same time, there was a research study by Kevin Hall from the NIH in 2019, and basically tried to put this to the test. We tend to see that ultra-processed foods are high in fat, salt, sugar, or what we traditionally used to call junk foods. Therefore, is it that ultra-processed foods are just another word for these items we already knew, and it's all down to nutrients? So they matched two diets that were provided in abundance to test, as we mentioned, the influence of our food environment and foods on our spontaneous energy intake, whether we eat how much we need, more or less than our energy requirements, or how much we feel when we feel full. And what they found is these two matched diets for macronutrients and presented energy. Participants spontaneously ate more on the ultra-processed and ate less on the minimally-processed, with divergent weight change. So we had now both observational research that was prospective and Kevin's clinical trial that kind of suggests there's more to ultra-processing than potentially what's in dietary guidance or nutrients. And that led us to our key question for the trial, because although ultra-processed foods tend to be nutritionally poor, not all are. Some have health claims, nutrition claims, so they're lower in salt, sugar, saturated fat, or may have higher intakes of fiber. So we wanted to really test this question. Is there, whilst there might be something to do with ultra-processed foods that are nutritionally poor, do we see the same effect in ultra-processed foods that are nutritionally better? Are we seeing an effect of ultra-processing, the purpose of changing foods to make them more profitable, at the level of current dietary guidance? We designed the trial to be in the real world, so participants received all their food to their home, and then they were going about their daily life, going to work, living with family. We made the diets 8 weeks in length to try and see if those effects persist and the longer term effect. And similarly, then we also tried to match those meals. So breakfast tried to be similar. So, for example, we might have a high fiber, low salt breakfast cereal on the ultra processed diet and compare that to overnight oats on the minimally processed diet. Might be a supermarket meal deal sandwich, compare that to a chicken salad with flatbreads made from flour, oil, and water, and then a ready meal that's ultra processed versus a made from scratch ready meal such as a shepherd's pie, cottage pie. And for the minimally processed diet, that was made by a small independent caterer that was all made bespoke from ingredients from scratch that you would find in the fruit and veg aisle, etc. And the ultra processed diet, that was all sourced from leading supermarkets, just typical food you would find as is in the real world. And then also to try and replicate this influence of potentially ultra processed foods on our eating, we provided the diet in abundance. Participants were not told it was a weight loss trial, weren't told to change their energy intake or weight, were just told to have as much or as little as they wanted. And in terms of these differences we tried to have between the two diets, we matched them for the current Eat Well guide, the UK Dietary Guidelines. So that's having your 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, having enough fiber, and limiting the amount of saturated fat, sugar, and salt in the diet. Beyond that, factors that weren't necessarily that aren't provided in UK dietary guidance and also implicated in this idea of the purpose of processing weren't accounted for to try and assess this influence if you were following the dietary guidance. So, for example, energy density wasn't matched. Although some of our work last year, it was a paper in the British Journal of Nutrition. If you look at ultra processed foods in the UK food supply that aren't high in fat, salt, sugar, so they don't have what's called a red traffic light on the front of the package, they're still more energy dense than other healthier minimally processed foods. So in the food supply, we see they are more energy dense. We don't really account for, there's not really much in the way of accounting for texture. So textural properties weren't necessarily accounted for. And we tried to provide foods as they would be experienced in the real world and how they may influence eating behaviors. So ultra processed foods still contain their packaging and any health and nutrition claims that may come with them, but no items were used that contain, say, a reduced calorie or reduced energy claim to try and avoid any bias around that. And then to try and make the mini processed diet as you would make at home, they were just provided in to the doors in Tupperware containers, and it just contained a blank, a plain label that just specified nutrients per 100 grams.
Okay, so what did you find? What were the principal findings?
So our primary outcome was the percentage weight change on the two diets. And we did that because in a free living trial with participants at home, it's much harder to actually track and monitor energy intake as they did in Kevin's trial. And what we found is across both diets, there was significant weight loss at the end of 8 weeks from both diets. But there was significantly more weight loss on the minimally processed diet.
Now, where does that leave us? Because I've seen some people post online that, okay, people lost more weight on the minimally processed diet, but people did lose weight on the ultra-processed diet. And so what that proves in their mind is that ultra-processed food or diet rich in ultra-processed foods can actually be very healthy and help people lose weight. Do you think that's an adequate interpretation of your results?
I think based on nutritional quality, we can kind of could have inferred that nutritionally better UPF probably isn't going to have the same health impact as high fat, salt, sugar, ultra processed foods. But what isn't clear till this trial is the fact that is that improvement as good, as better, or worse than a similarly designed diet that's nutritionally better, made of minimally processed foods. So on the one hand, switching from that nutritionally poor ultra processed diet to the nutritionally better ultra processed diet is an improvement. With that's pretty clear. And what's clear from this trial is dietary guidance works when people can stick with it. But what's also clear is the important is the control arm of this trial. The comparison was between the ultra processed and the minimally processed diet. And in that respect, the ultra processed diet was not as effective for weight loss. And that's the key aspect to remember. It's ultra processing seems to have an effect on the quality of the diet. So ultra processed food, ultra processing doesn't care whether the food is animal based, plant based. It doesn't necessarily care about the general food groups. But what it can tell us a bit more about is whether those food groups and those products have undergone extra changes to try and create more profit, and they may not be as advantageous to just having those foods in their original form.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I thought similarly that there's two important concepts that I think the viewers may appreciate understanding a bit more clearly. The people you recruited were at their baseline in the normal habitual diet, consuming more than 50% of their calories in the form of ultra-processed foods, right? And in some cases, probably substantially more than that, because the average in the United Kingdom is probably closer to 60 or 70%, I would guess. And they didn't necessarily pick those ultra-processed foods to be consistent with the dietary guidelines in the United Kingdom, right? They just picked ultra-processed foods based on their whatever preference they have, taste preferences, assume price. So it's very likely that people started out coming from a diet rich in ultra-processed foods that quite likely contained quite a bit of what we would call junk foods, right? Like really lots of potato chips and these types of prepared, very salty, fatty, sugary kind of meals that we, I think have very good reason to believe that people tend to overeat on quite massively. And so then they were switched to the diet that was similarly high in ultra-processed foods, but now specifically chosen to meet at least some criteria, right? To meet these criteria that you outlined for the dietary guidelines, they tended to lose weight. And that's maybe not a surprise, right? Now, in a way, you could argue, okay, they switched from eating a mix of ultra-processed foods that contained probably some junk foods to ultra-processed foods that were specifically chosen to be, healthier in some aspects, right? And predictably, that was maybe a little bit better, but not nearly as good as switching to a diet rich in minimally processed foods. The other aspect I would like to emphasize is that in a randomized controlled trial, the strongest comparison certainly always is between the two trial arms, right? So while you're reporting changes within each arm, we always need to be, considerate of the fact that when we run any kind of trial, and I've done a whole bunch of trials where we've looked at changes in body weight, what happens is that the moment you give people some kind of controlled diet, and you ask them to eat as much or as little of that as they want, they certainly usually tend to lose a little bit of weight. With every single study that we've done, that's been the case, even if the diet wasn't designed to be particularly healthy. And that's simply because, you come to some medical center and people in lab coats give you your meals, and you are probably motivated to be more healthy or motivated to do something positive for your health. And so in my experience, and if we just look broadly at the literature, almost all dietary studies, we see some weight loss in all arms. And so for that reason, it's very important to keep in mind that what we should mostly be doing is compare changes between, not within, but between the trial arms. So in this case, the strongest conclusion we can draw here from your study is that the degree of weight loss was greater in the minimally processed foods arm compared to this healthier ultra-processed foods arm. Would you agree with those two assessments?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the difference between the within diet and the between diets, and we tried to estimate that as a relative amount, and it was came out just around a medium effect size. So if you compare the weight loss on the ultra processed diet compared to the actual weight reduction, without the effect of going on to the dietary guidance, it was around a medium effect of a similar size of then having that diet that was not ultra processed. So it's that important distinction between where they started and where they could have been on a different diet.
Okay, so would you say now, looking at the body of evidence, the observational studies, Kevin Hall's study, I think there was one other trial, now yours trial, where would that leave us in terms of, as a normal person going through their normal life, going to a grocery store? Would you say that the evidence is now good, very good, excellent, conclusive, that we will benefit in terms of our body weight trajectory if we choose more minimally processed foods and less ultra processed foods?
I think the evidence is definitely growing. I always hate to use the phrase conclusive because nothing in research is ever conclusive, and there's always limitations. I think what's clear first and foremost is choosing your diet solely based on whether it's ultra processed or not may still carry unintended consequences. For example, suddenly increase your butter consumption or red meat intake drastically. But by and large, if you follow a healthy, balanced diet and it's not as full of so many ultra processed foods, it does appear that there's going to be some effect, some improvement and benefit on that. I think what's important to come on to this point as well is typically ultra processed foods are cheap, and it's typically the high fat, salt, sugar, nutritionally poor ultra processed foods that are cheap. And particularly in the UK and in the US, there's a massive socio-economic inequality and around access to healthy food. So there was a report by the Food Foundation called the Broken Plate Report that came out earlier this year, and it showed the bottom 20% of earners in the UK, that household, if they've got children, you've got to spend 70% of your disposable income just to meet the current dietary guidance. Compare that to 10%, 11% of your disposable income, the top 20%. And we also know that generally nutritionally better foods are twice the price as unhealthy foods in the UK. And that price rise there's been a price rise recently to a greater extent with healthy foods. So I always like to think when we think about healthy foods and how we can do that, but to appreciate there's this wider environment that we're trying to kind of move around. And although it'd be ideal if we can go to a healthy balanced diet of minimally processed foods, it's obviously very difficult for many people. And this is where the purpose of processing and overclassification tries to address is it's not just about the level of the food, it's about the drivers that have shaped that food environment and the fact that we have an environment full of typically nutritionally poor foods. And even when we try and look at those nutritionally better foods, a lot of people are priced out. So yeah, it's a landscape that needs that higher level policy action and governments to take notice. But it's very tricky when you've got financial drivers and financial incentives that are driving our food environment and people suggesting that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think we're both, I assume, very much on the same page that, this is not about putting blame on consumers who are purchasing these ultra processed foods. We're very well aware of, why that may be happening. And, I think ultimately for now, it's about the science and trying to provide good scientific evidence that can hopefully in the future inform policy decisions to make
Absolutely.
healthier foods more easily available, make that more cheaper. So, now my perspective you would like to share is that I agree with you that, nothing's conclusive here, particularly because ultra processed foods, first of all, we currently have a definition with the NOVA classification system, ultra processed foods being NOVA category 4. But the types of ultra processed foods that we find in the marketplace, they're constantly changing, right? And one thing I would certainly like to express is that it is very well possible that in the future, we'll see many more foods in the marketplace that are ultra processed, but that actually were designed with an intent to be healthier. And we can discuss in the next few steps what that may entail. And so it may well be that at some point in the future, this whole debate about, is ultra processed foods triggering overeating, that's going to change quite a bit. But based on what we currently have in the marketplace in most countries, I personally am rather feeling that most people would benefit from minimizing their consumption of ultra processed foods, partly to avoid overeating calories spontaneously, partly due to other potential health risks, right? So what do you see as, when you look at your study and you look at the literature, what do you see as potential mechanisms through which ultra-processed foods seem to be driving higher ad libitum energy intake?
So I think first and foremost is their typical nutritionally poor profile, which is then what we've tried to account for. So if we then look at our study, particular mechanisms, also based on the wider evidence we have around foods and spontaneous energy intake, energy density is likely to be a key factor here. And also just generally wider sensory properties that aren't explicitly captured in the concept of just nutrients per se. We know that a lot of these products go through extensive consumer sensory testing to choose the exact one that's people going to choose over a competitor product. So it's sight, smell, taste, mouthfeel, all these factors are influenced to make sure that it's just right and it's chosen. So energy density in particular is probably one factor. We know that just energy dense foods, it's easier to spontaneously overconsume them. And particularly as well, the purpose of processing. And if you're going to be using lots of commodity cheap ingredients instead of kind of whole foods, and then you hold it together with cosmetic additives, it's going to be texturally softer. And we know that when you combine calorie-dense foods, so more calories per bite with a softer texture, it's easier to just overeat before you know it. So that's probably some key factors. Those wider sensory properties, which again we know are being influenced in the foods, but we don't typically capture it in our research tools. And I think going forwards, I think you made a really nice point there around how the landscape will change and how we say understand healthier foods that are ultra processed. Because obviously at the moment they're still in the concept of there being that health impact is through the lens of financial profit. So companies are only making a healthier product if it sells. A good example is say Cadbury's released a 30% reduced fat product. It came out 5 years ago. It was 30% reduced fat, but it was only marginally lower in calories. But then it was taken off the market because it didn't do very well. So it's that food, that environment we need to consider, and the fact that yes, we can use processing fantastically well. It's fantastic when it's used primarily for health benefit, and we need to make sure that that food system leverages the fact that health and environment are incentives rather than purely financial. So yeah, I think it'll be the energy density, textural softness, most likely, the sensory and visual appeal that come into play. Those will be the main factors really, and then you can then start going into the less well evidenced aspects around cosmetic additives. But realistically, their main impact may be in the influence on the sensory properties and how much we may be eating, rather than any potential like direct impact. And I think our research tools need to be a lot more advanced before we can start really drawing any direct conclusions between those and health.
Yeah, sensory properties is what I commonly on this channel have referred to as hyperpalatability. So basically foods that are designed to be hyperpalatable. Michael Moss describes this very nicely in his book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, where, it's basically the food industry over the last few decades has just perfected the art of doing research prior to the release of a food to really maximize the degree to which people experience this bliss when they're consuming a food. And so by tinkering with, exactly how much sugar and how much fat and how much salt goes into each food, it's not a coincidence that, when you have these types of ice creams or crackers or potato chips, that the moment you have one, you want to have the whole package, right? I think that's a almost universal human experience. And so I think it's important for people to understand that that's not coincidence. The companies have put a lot of money, work, and time into making the product the way it is. So I agree, hyperpalatability is certainly in my book one of the big ones. You mentioned texture, and I think there's good evidence for this, right? That just the need for example, more chewing with minimally processed foods, whereas ultra-processed foods tend to be softer and can be eaten much more quickly, is likely a big one. Energy density, of course, I think also is very quite clearly established as a major driver of how many calories we choose to eat, both in the short term, like within a meal, and also over, say, an extended period of time. But a couple of factors I wanted to ask your opinion about, and that is that often when we look at the average ultra-processed food in the marketplace, they tend to be lower in protein and lower in fiber than, let's say a basket of minimally processed foods. Because minimally processed foods tend to either be high in protein or high in fiber, or say in the case of legumes, fairly high in both. How do you feel about these two factors? And can you talk about how you considered them in your study?
Yeah, two very interesting factors. So we know from the protein leverage hypothesis, there is an idea around how much protein is in the diet relatively and absolutely that may influence how much people eat and whether they overeat. On our diet, so the amount of protein we provided was based on there's been lots of modeling on the percentage intakes of protein, carbs, and fat on the Eat Well guide. Basically recommends less than 35% of fat, around 50% carbs, and that leaves around 14.5 to 15.5% protein. So we modeled it around the 15% mark. Similarly with fiber, recommendations are more than 30 grams per day of fiber. So we provided that more than that per 2,000 calories. And obviously fiber has a particular influence in terms of influencing energy density and texture. So I think it'd be very difficult then to fully entangle those. We obviously know fiber has wider health benefits as well. So I think that's definitely a key factor for the general diet that's typically nutritionally poor and ultra processed. not something we can necessarily go into too much specific detail on our trial because we didn't, unlike Kevin's trial, where all the foods were in a metabolic ward, we provided them in the real world. So we don't have exact energy intakes from each meal. But what was interesting around the protein was, again, this was from the self-reported dietary intake data on the trial, was we did notice the minimally processed diet self-report was slightly higher in reported protein intake, whether that had some influence. But again, I wouldn't want to hold too much strength on that just because we know that the influence of self-report diet intake data. So I definitely think they are potential components. It's very hard to say they aren't. And there was actually a new, very short-term RCT comparing two ultra-processed diets, one very high in protein, about 30% protein, and one was a bit lower in protein, I think about 15%. And they did find that there was lower energy intake and also differences in thermic effect of food that led to less excess consumption with the higher protein diet. So it's probably playing a part.
So yeah, thank you for commenting on this because that ties into this comment I made earlier that if we think if you were say to advise the food industry, so let's say someone from Unilever or Nestle or some other company came to you and said, hey, based on your research and your read of the literature, how would you suggest we change the types of ultra processed foods we put on the market? Like, what ideally would you like to see in terms of those foods? Like, in what specific factors would you try to change to maybe create ultra processed foods that maybe are ideally, as highly affordable as what we currently have in the marketplace and as convenient, right? There's a lot of benefits to ultra processed foods, but that at the same time are less likely to trigger this type of overeating response.
So what you're mentioning there around the nutrient reformulation of products, often it's typically focused around a single nutrient. So we mentioned about Cadbury's and reducing the fat. It only takes one aspect and doesn't necessarily address other aspects. So reducing the sugar, sorry, not the fat. It only addresses one aspect. And actually, we know that from, say, this purpose of processing concept, there's more to food that may influence overeating than just the fat content. So realistically, the key aspects are how can we address the properties that may spontaneously increase excess energy intake. So one is eating rate, and that's obviously influenced by energy density and texture. But the problem is we know that energy density and texture are sensory properties that are influencing how much people like them. So realistically, for a lot of these companies, unless there's a financial incentive to be able to change this without the risk of losing out to competitors, it's not going to happen. And that's where the food system, the food environment needs to change to create the environment, because companies just do what they're going to do, which is drive profit. So until that changes to incentivize these changes in the products that can be done, it's never going to happen. So yeah, it's around that wider properties, talk about the sensory properties first and foremost. And obviously we can then compare that with what's called a whole food reformulation. So rather than having an ultra processed version that's not as dense, not as texturally soft, not as high in fat, salt, sugar, we can obviously just replace it with a minimally processed version. But obviously then we come with all these other aspects you talked about, which is the time, cost, convenience. And actually, a preprint that's just come out recently that might be of interest for this was from Kevin Hall and Aaron Hengist from the who's now still at the NIH. Aaron is, and what they did was designed ultra processed menus and minimally processed menus that met the current US dietary guidance, and then tried to look at the trade-offs between cost, convenience, etc. So it's worth having a read of that. It's a preprint and just showing how there are trade-offs between a convenient diet and a healthy diet and a cheap diet. So yeah, there's these different factors that we all need to consider. So it's in a perfect world, we would suggest all these sensory changes, but we've got to appreciate the system it's working in before we can really make those differences.
How do you feel about enriching foods with, say, protein and fiber specifically? Because that's something we already see to some degree, right? That certain fibers are added to yogurts, or that protein is being added to foods to make them seem more healthy or maybe be more healthy. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I wouldn't like to comment too far. I'm not the expert on protein. I know that there's obviously long discussions around protein, source of protein, and aspects such as mortality. And then obviously it comes back to what we've been trying to study with the update trial, is the fact that is that source of protein better than not having that protein. For example, sometimes they might take out the sugar and put the protein in, so it's still an energy dense product, and you're adding more calories there. But also, is that as beneficial as, say, going for a minimally processed plant-based source such as lentils, pulses, legumes, etc., and whether that would confer a greater benefit. And again, we know that generally those are quite cheap options. The difficulty is making sure that we can incorporate that into a meal or a menu. So yeah, I wouldn't like to say too much around adding more into it. I would my gut instinct would be adding fiber would be of benefit. Of course, it needs to consider what that we're adding fiber to, and obviously whether that fiber is going to influence the sensory properties that then leads to that product being launched but then discontinued because no one buys it. So yeah, sorry for not giving a conclusive answer
So,
there.
no, I mean it's a really difficult question. I think your answer reflects the fact that this is a nuanced question, right? And I think one thing maybe I would like to also chime in on is this is an area where it's very easy to maybe put the blame on the food companies and say, you guys only want to maximize your profit. And yeah, that's true. They're designing foods to sell, but it's also true that we consumers, as a group, would probably not buy these foods. Would probably not buy these foods if they were made to be a lot more healthy, right? And so that makes it basically impossible for a food company, as you said earlier, to create kind of healthier alternatives, because that would basically, put in jeopardy their entire business, right? If they can't sell the foods that they're making. So it's a real conundrum that I do think needs to be addressed. And I'm not entirely sure. I do personally feel policy could be a guiding factor here, maybe using some form of taxation. Certainly, I feel it would be beneficial to, outlaw marketing, for example, to children of some of these foods, or making these foods systematically available to children. That shouldn't be so easy. Putting these types of soda machines and these types of snack foods into schools, for example, in vending machines. That I think that those are all steps that could be taken. So it's a much bigger, more nuanced problem, and I absolutely agree with that.
It
And,
is.
uh, and
And
an
just one point on that as well, Mario, is these products are, it's not just the product itself, but it's the marketing that comes with it. And you mentioned there about the aspects on children. And we also know that obviously ultra processed high sugar breakfast cereals, we often have things like cartoon characters, and that influences choice of these products. And even just presentation of portion sizes. So a lot of breakfast cereals present a portion size that's far, far bigger than what's recommended on the serving size. And this influences some great work by Emma Boylan showing that this influences how much children eat, and these messages are influencing social norms. So the ultra processed concept, the business model, isn't just the product. It's all the marketing that comes with it, and it's the pricing, the praise, the promotion. And this is the what we need to kind of think more about. It's not just a case of, say, reformulating. It will have a benefit if we can reformulate, but we've got to think about that environment the reformulation is sitting in if we want to make a difference.
Yeah, very, very, very good point. Okay, so let's maybe go back to your study, and I wanted to just address one particular criticism that I've seen online, and that is that some people basically just said, okay, I read this paper, looks like a good paper, but isn't this essentially just saying that people eat more of yummy food than of not so yummy food, or maybe even yucky food? Isn't that like the science that, we basically in one time diet, we give people this food that is designed to be delicious and, hyper palatable. And in another, we give them food that's like home cooked, that's even visually, you had some images there that you shared, that is just visually a lot less appealing. And isn't this is this really an interesting scientific finding, or is this not something that our grandmother would have known? Like 50 years ago, she could have said, okay, well, if I make you a delicious cake, you're going to eat more calories of that than if I make you a bad cake. What's your response to that type of criticism?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important aspect to consider, and it's also a tricky one because it's that circular loop. We know that these products go under this intentional purposing to make them tasty and accessible, but we also know that that in itself is going to influence how much people eat. And obviously, we on the trial we provided ultra processed foods exactly as we found them in the real world, so that's how they were designed. And we obviously, before we started the trial, we had a number of different potential caterers that we could have used, independent caterers. And we did some testing, and we tested some of the meals on the menus as well to check them. And obviously, they all seemed palatable and enjoyable. And when you design these trials, you try and equate for these factors. And to the best of your ability, sometimes it doesn't quite pan out that way. So when we asked, what we did was, it wasn't a pre-planned analysis, but after the two diets, when they started their behavioral support program. So the trial has a second behavioral support program, which is kind of being analysed now. And when they sat down with one of the team and they got asked, how did you rate their diets overall? How did you rate their textures, taste, delivery, preparation, sustainability, etc.? We asked them 9 different questions, and 7 of 9 weren't different between the two diets. So overall, sustainability, etc., those were similar. But we did find that there was a slightly higher rating of taste on the ultra processed diet. So yeah, it's obviously a factor to consider. And we tried to design the two diets to be appealing and enjoyable. Um, but yeah, it's obviously one factor that's at play there, and it's tricky to say consider to what extent it can be adjusted for. Say it's is it a confounder or is it a potential explanatory factor?
Yeah, I think personally, if hyperpalatability simply, and this particular appealing texture that is designed into these products, if those are integral parts of these foods, by design by these companies, then I think it raises the question, well, that's just a really important aspect of what these foods are, at least as we said at this time. And we need to be, aware that that's what's going on, and in a way, I think we need to almost step back and ask ourselves this philosophical question. Maybe we need to be honest that, if we want to be healthy, we need to be willing to not seek out the maximum reward with every second of our lives, including every meal, right? It relates to many other things as well. We know for sure, for example, that our cell phones are rewarding, but it also isn't healthy to just follow that, seek that reward all day, every day. Can quite destroy our lives, right, if we do that. And similarly, if we went for just the most rewarding foods with every meal, every snack, I think what these data do suggest is that it'll become very, very difficult for your body to regulate your body weight in a way that you will remain healthy, and you will almost certainly increase your calorie intake spontaneously without even trying to, just because these foods are so delicious and have other properties that make you overeat them, and you will likely gain weight. So I do think it's a fair criticism, but at the same time, I also feel, it's hard to do something about this if hyperpalatability is a built-in property of these foods, right?
Indeed. And say obviously in Kevin's trial about 5 years ago, they obviously found the ratings were quite similar. And it's I actually spoke with their dietitians when we were in the planning stage, and they kind of said in the minimally processed diet, in order to match for the salt content, they were kind of trying to hide the salt in the minimally processed foods. And also, we know the importance of salt for palatability and enjoyment, and whether when you have a really high salt intake, it can kind of mask some of these differences. So obviously in our trial, they were within much lower. But yeah, it's one of those where it's a criticism, but also it's a potential explainer.
So maybe let's move to like the policy aspect a little bit, because the question certainly that arises from studies such as yours, Kevin's study, is, okay, what should we advise the public to do now? If you were in charge of the dietary guidelines, would you think it's justified that we tell people to minimize the consumption of ultra processed foods, even ultra processed foods? Or should we continue to just point out that they need to pay attention to these nutritional properties? Just don't even mention that degree of processing matters. Just tell people, eat slowly, purchase foods that have low energy density and maybe higher protein and fiber content that are not hyperpalatable. So in other words, the question is, should we take the current dietary guidelines in most countries, like in the United States, for example, it's almost all like nutrient, based, maybe food based, but processing doesn't really factor into this yet. Or should we extend this and add the degree of processing as one additional consideration just by itself?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And we know that dietary guidelines are really important because they influence public health policy. And from that front, we need to consider the fact that the purpose of processing seems to be capturing something that is important, but not in our current dietary guidance. So we need to be factoring some aspect of it in there. I also appreciate that I don't think that ultra processing per se should be a consumer facing tool. I think it offers sometimes a heuristic that may have unintended consequences. And some people may find it complicated or maybe stigmatizing. But what I think was important is appreciating the factors that are implicated in that purpose. As you mentioned, the sensory properties, the energy density, and of course, that starts to get a really complicated message when you start adding all these factors into our current dietary guidance that no one follows. So I think we do need to add something in there to allow policy to act upon it, whether it should be explicitly that purpose of processing, because we know it may influence consumers' activities, or we focus on these other factors, whilst also appreciating that if you specify the factors, you may not necessarily capture all of them. So I think it's important that we need to add something in there to try and help shape policy so we can act on these food systems levers to improve the food environment. How it may exactly take form or shape, I think there's a lot of more discussion to think about that because, as I say, there's potential unintended consequences and potentially kind of other factors to consider. But yeah, I think what's clear is there's something more than what we're currently telling people.
Yeah, I agree. And to be very clear to people, I think neither of us is saying we should only talk about the degree of processing. I think this is in addition to established known factors that affect health. But it's, in our opinion, one additional factor, as you say nicely, there seems to be something that is captured when we talk about the degree of processing that, is not, at least not easily captured when we look at established dietary factors that we tend to usually focus on.
Exactly. Yeah.
The last point I really wanted to talk about is, I think, an important one, and that is that I'm seeing quite a bit online, even in publications, but mostly on social media, what I perceive as a push by food industry or food industry sponsored scientists to somehow, I want to say, discourage a discourse about ultra processed foods or even the NOVA classification system, right? Ultra processed foods are NOVA category 4. And I see quite a few colleagues, for example, who have published even papers saying, oh, this is unscientific. The whole NOVA classification system, the whole concept of ultra processed foods is unscientific. We shouldn't be talking about this. Some even go so far as like making formal pledges online saying, I pledge never to talk about NOVA or ultra processed foods again. And, what I will respect is maybe some people really have this view that this is a suboptimal scientific concept and needs to be worked on. And I think I personally actually agree that, yes, there is additional work to be done to maybe define a little bit more clearly in some cases what is an ultra processed food and what isn't. There's certainly some areas where it's a little unclear. But I also have this impression that this is a little bit of a continuation of a trend that has been going on for at least 20 years or so, in my view, that the food industry and food industry sponsored scientists are, trying to discourage a discourse that is not advantageous to them. And personally, I find that regrettable because, we're seeing the consequences of ultra processed foods quite clearly in public health data. And personally, I would wish there was a little bit more of an willingness to, work with academic scientists to find actual solutions rather than trying to discuss the problem away or argue there is nothing to see here, right? What's your view on this?
I think it's a really important point here. And as we say, the purpose of food processing and ultra processing has quite big implications for what are the actions to improve our food system and make healthy foods more affordable and accessible. And the key aspect of that is it implicates the large food corporations that are producing most of these ultra processed foods. And we've seen this in the literature the last few years. We see influence of these corporations in lobbying and influencing different political aspects. So there's a serious political implication of this research and literature. And it is important because we know in wider fields that the role of conflicts of interest can influence the research. But one question is the relative comparison. We know that diets and foods, we've got to compare it to something else. And we see in other fields that the red meat example, there's a recent paper that, depending on whether a study is food industry funded or not, may alter the question that's being addressed or asked, and then whether that's relevant for public health policy or relevant for actually addressing the key problem. And I think we see that here in the ultra-processed literature, is because some of the critics are arguing about the purpose of processing. We get back to the story around arguing, they argue about processing or the degree of processing by itself, which is the NOVA classification, basically trying to make a straw man argument and then repeating that over and over again, which can then lead to confusion about what it actually is. And actually, just recently, there's a preprint just come out by a team at Cambridge. So it's Martin White, June Adams, and team. It's quite a big list of people, Esther Vamos and Chris Millett from Imperial. And they actually looked at what was the in the media, the people who were talking about ultra-processed food in a positive, neutral or negative light. Who were they and what was their relation to industry? It's a really interesting read. And essentially, most of the articles are positively framing around ultra-processed food, highlighting it as we've said, a food system issue and looking at the bigger picture. And a small number were then having a negative view on ultra-processed foods. And these tended to be academics making these claims that they was negative, and they were academic with industry relations. So their conclusions were the need to research to highlight the need for close retention to the interests of actors discussing public health topics in the media. So again, I'm sure you'll provide the link. It's really interesting reading and something where we need to take into account who's talking and what their influence is, and what they're suggesting is the issue, and what they're suggesting should be controlled for. And yeah, it is an issue because it then fundamentally impacts on policy implications, public health. And I think the key thing around the purpose of processing, and as you say, it's not the perfect tool, but it's a tool that is showing some value. We need to work out how we can use that values in different ways. And it's actually quite unscientific to completely try and ignore, refute, and shut down a line of scientific work. You don't really see that in any other fields. Most fields will try and work to improve the system. So it's quite an interesting angle that they're taking there. So yeah, it's an interesting paper to read. I think it's definitely something that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, I work in a lot of different areas in nutrition. And for example, I've worked in diabetes research for a long time. And for a lot of issues in diabetes, let's say how we even measure blood sugar levels, it's actually not that straightforward. You know, for example, HbA1c as a measure of long-term glucose isn't as perfect as people think. CGMs are not nearly as perfect as people think. You know, there's a lot of measurement issues there. And yet that is being addressed in a scientific way, right? No one is coming out and just saying, you know, there's limitations to these methods. We should never just even talk about them. You know, I herewith pledge to never talk about, you know, blood sugar again, or I never talk about HbA1c again. I find this a very strange approach, right? What I would really love to see is that people, whoever they are, whatever their affiliations and whatever they, you know, even if they work at any of these food companies, I obviously understand the amount of money that's at stake here. But at the same time, to basically what I perceive as quite aggressively try to quiet down like people like us who talk about these issues and make it sound like we're not scientists and we're not scientific because we use a concept that, according to them, is not scientific. I see it as highly problematic. And this actually, if anyone pays attention to this, traces back at least 20 years when food, you know, processed foods and the idea that processed foods, you know, particularly strongly, like what we can now call ultra-processed foods, may come with health problems. When that was first coming up, there were concerted efforts by, you know, professionals like nutritionists to really get out the message that cooking at home from scratch with whole foods is clearly is likely the better way. I think at the time is how they worded it, how they felt. And there's documented major efforts by food industry to hire, you know, whole armies of, you know, young women who would cook at home with these ultra processed foods and portray that as like the modern, the sexy way of the successful woman to feed her family. So this is not, you know, the first time we're seeing something like this. And I personally am really skeptical and critical of this development, and would really feel that the public should pay some attention to if they get messaging about ultra-processed food or the degrees of processing, like who is the messenger here, and what may be their motives and what may be their conflicts of interests. So, I'm not at all saying this issue is settled and that we don't need to do more research or that we don't need to improve the NOVA classification system or these things. Like everything else in science, this is developing and will change over time. But to try to do away with the debate by saying it's unscientific just doesn't seem plausible in my way, and quite clearly motivated by ulterior motives. Let's just say it like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so as Sam said, we're going to have a whole bunch of papers that are related to this that I'm going to link in the blog post that's associated with this video, which you can find on the website. The link to that post is always, as always, in the description box below this video. All right, Sam, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you will continue doing your stellar work in this area. I think it's extremely important. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mario. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. And it's been good getting into all these little topics that really need to be discussed.
Thank you. Take care. Okay, that was my conversation with Dr. Sam Dicken. You can find a link to Sam's homepage at the University College London, as well as links to all references mentioned in this conversation on my website, linked in the description box below. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I will do my best to respond. If you enjoyed this content, please consider leaving a like below, and don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in nutrition and the prevention of chronic disease. You can also support the creation of content such as this by becoming a patron of the channel. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description box below. I would like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who are already generously supporting this channel. Due to personal and family issues, I have not published a video this summer, and I'm amazed that almost all of my patrons have continued their support throughout this time. A big thank you for that. Take care.